All right. All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rachelle Meilleur, and I am an instructor at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies here in Kyoto, Japan. Today, I'm going to talk about machine translation. Now, I realized in my title that I have here friend or foe, but in fact, it's not a dichotomy. We all use machine translation. It has its benefits. However, what I want to talk about today is how it impacts language learners in the academic context. So there's a lot to cover today, and I don't want to get bogged down in specific details about like how machine translation works. So I'm just going to try to go through as much as I can, as fast as I can. And hopefully we will be able to have time for questions afterwards. So the first thing I want to start with is a definition of machine translation and plagiarism. So I'm using this term PAMT, plagiarism and machine translation, because they're often quite connected. So with plagiarism, of course, this is the unauthorized or unattributed use of another person's work, usually presented as one's own. And in terms of our students, this has always usually been a copying from print or online sources, or using photos or other creative media in whole or in part, or self-plagiarism. So using work that you created for one class and submitting it to another. That tends to be what has mostly been done in the past and still continues to be done. However, with the pandemic, we had a new problem, and that was that of machine translation. So, of course, in the past, the preferred tool of use was Google Translate, but that has changed now, I think, to DeepL. And I'm not arguing against the use of machine translation as a useful tool in our everyday lives. What I'm going to talk about here in this definition is how it's being used mostly by students in academia. So in the past, what a lot of students would do is translate existing work from an L1 or any other language and translate it into the language of the submission. So for example, my Japanese students might actually use Japanese texts, translate them into English. Now, if they source it like they should, that's not a problem. The problem has always been in the past is translating another person's work and then submitting it as your own. But since the pandemic, what has been the bigger issue is the fact that students are actually writing in their L1 and then using machine translation to translate part or the entire assignment using machine translation. And in either case, if you are not acknowledging the use of machine translation, it's a form of plagiarism. So that's what I'm talking about today when I'm talking about machine translation and how it's being used by students in academia. So now, is machine translation unavoidable? Pretty much, yeah. It's part of our everyday lives. And many instructors will say, you know, it's here to stay. We just need to learn to accept it. And I've seen this argument a lot where we should consider machine translation like a calculator. You know, we don't make students do calculations by hand. We allow them to use calculators. So we should allow students to use machine translation. The problem with this is I don't think it's a very good analogy, but if we stick with that analogy, even with math, we let students learn, and for years, how to do math problems before we give them the calculator. We don't give 5-year-olds calculators. They need to learn how to do math first before we allow them to use a calculator many years later. And I would argue that that's the same with language learners. If you've got high-level students or high intermediate students, then yes, they probably could use machine translation as a language learning tool to aid them in their language learning. But if you're a low-level student and you can't understand what the machine translation is doing, you can't see any mistakes, it's much better than anything that you could have created yourself, then you probably shouldn't be using it. So that's my argument against the calculator analogy, because that comes up a lot with machine translation. And I've already talked about this a little bit in the issues to consider, but at the bottom I have how do instructors and institutions evaluate language abilities when machine translation is present. So even if you are allowing machine translation, we have to know how we're going to deal with that and what exactly we are evaluating. So back in 2020, 2021, it became clear that machine translation was different than it had been before. And for me, I faced the problem of having a fourth-year student who's writing their graduation thesis. They did all 20 pages through machine translation. But the problem was my university did not actually have a policy concerning machine translation as a form of plagiarism. And what I've noticed in Japan and in other universities is they may have, and they probably do have, some sort of policy concerning plagiarism, but it's usually a very generic statement, like if you do it, there will be consequences. But there's not a step-by-step guide. There are no guidelines for instructors or students as to what constitutes plagiarism. So because I did not want to fail my student or create problems about this, I actually started looking at what other universities were doing. So I was looking at universities around the world, Oxford, Cambridge, MIT, all over, plus universities in Japan. And many of them actually do have clauses about machine translation in their plagiarism policies. And here in Japan at Ritsumeikan University, which is based here in Kyoto, they've even stated that even the use of one sentence of machine translation will be considered plagiarism and will be treated as such. So different universities have different policies. At my university, my colleagues and I came up with a 10% rule, which is not more than 10% of any assignment can use machine translation. So if it's a 100-word paragraph, not more than 10 of those words could be machine translated. Now, some people think that this is too much, but we were after a lot of discussions, we just decided, the reality is they are language learners. They are going to use machine translation and dictionaries and other things. We can't stop them from using it, and they should use it, but they just need to be careful about how much of it they're using within an assignment. So at my university, we've gone with the 10% rule. And now this isn't an official policy, but it's what we're using in the faculty that I am in. Now, I'm going to focus here on DeepL because I think it's a little bit different than how we've looked at Google Translate in the past. Because I think DeepL has done a lot to force teachers to question their own sanity. Because I've talked with colleagues, both online and in person, and people go crazy because they'll see some writing from a student and be like, this looks like a native speaker wrote it, but I know my student couldn't write it. But all of their tricks for finding plagiarism doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's not plagiarized in the same sense. Students have written in their L1 and translated wholesale. So to that, I say, trust your intuition and experience. If something doesn't seem right to you, it's probably not right. Now, DeepL, unlike Google Translate, really relies on context for the translation, and it does provide near native-like text. However, it's not perfect. And some people will say, oh, it's not perfect, so why is everyone going on and on about DeepL? But here's the thing, it will have little quirks in the translation, whether it's vocabulary use or grammar usage. And people will complain about that. But for me, that's actually what creates the difficulty. Because of those quirks, I think, this isn't quite native-like. So maybe the student did write it, but in fact, they didn't. Now, how to find instances of DeepL? Well, one thing that DeepL does is sometimes it will double a sentence. It will repeat it twice, but with a slight variation. And since students don't always proofread, they may actually keep both variations of a sentence in their writing. So if you see a double sentence, that's a clear indicator that deep L was used. Also along the lines of not proofreading, students will often forget to remove the tagline that this was translated by deep L at the end of their assignment. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that myself. Now, I know probably most people are dealing with smaller assignments, maybe a paragraph or a 5-page essay, but I teach fourth-year students who have to do 20-page theses in order to graduate. And what I noticed in these longer pieces of writing is that things that used deep L for translation had 0 paragraph breaks. So the entire section, which could be 3 or 4 pages long, would be one long paragraph. And when I would ask the students to create the paragraph breaks, they were not able to do it because they didn't write it. The machine translation wrote it for them. So that's another clue to finding a deep L translation. Also, if you are using a plagiarism checker, whether it's Turnitin or whatever your institution is using, what I have noticed is that students who do the right thing, and this is for research writing, where they are paraphrasing and sourcing their sources, they will actually have some sort of a percentage score, 20 or 30%, because the plagiarism checker actually recognizes where they're getting this information from. But students who are using machine translation to translate their original text will have almost 0% or 1% on a plagiarism checker. So if you see that, that should ring a lot of alarm bells, because it shouldn't look like that. They should actually have proper referencing and paraphrasing within their papers. And the last thing I'm going to mention here is the loss of mistranslated words. Now, I don't know where everyone is based, but here in Japan, I notice students often use the word precious in the wrong way. So like I went to Tokyo Disneyland, and it was a precious experience for me. That's not how native speakers of English would use the word precious. Saying they often tend to use the word human instead of using people or man, woman, child, for example. But what I've noticed that since the DeepL has come on the scene, I very rarely see these mistranslated words, because those mistranslated words were coming from dictionary use. But with a DeepL translation, DeepL does it more like how a native speaker would say, so it doesn't use these inappropriate vocabulary words. So if you find yourself wondering where all the missing vocabulary words that annoy you are going, that's what's happened, is because students are using machine translation. Now, if you're an educator, what can you do about this? Of course, just be open and clear with your students. We all know that they know about these sort of translation programs. And I would argue that, having at least one class per semester dealing with this topic is important. And when I say one class, I don't mean the class is about paraphrasing and how to source. I mean, just talking about what plagiarism is, what machine translation is, and when it's appropriate to use and how to use it. Now, at my institution, we are also asking writing teachers to get handwritten samples of writing. Now, I know people love online work. They love their Google Classroom or whatever they're using, but the only way to guarantee that you have an unadulterated form of writing from the student is for it to be handwritten. So in my case, what I do is in the very first class, I get students to write about their goals for 20 minutes. Halfway through the semester, I give them another free writing assignment, and at the end of the semester again. And I keep those samples. I don't hand them back to the students, because in the event that I am unsure of a student's writing, whether or not they are capable of doing what they've submitted, I can compare it against their handwritten work. Now, I know their handwritten work will be not as good as what they can do online, but it still gives me a sense of what they are capable of. And if it's, someone is at A1 level and they're submitting something that's C2, something is wrong there. So having handwritten samples is really useful. Another thing to consider, which I've done at other institutions, is having students sign a pledge for major assignments. Not every assignment, but just the major ones, saying, I understand what plagiarism is, I understand what machine translation is, and I have not done it. Sign, dated. So that later, if there is a problem, the students cannot say, oh, I didn't know. You've talked about it in class, you've given them information in their L1, and they've signed a form saying, I didn't do it. So these are things that we're actually trialing this year, different forms to see how it works with our students. The other thing too, of course, is to be clear about the consequences of using machine translation or plagiarizing and following through on those consequences, because I think, you know, it's easy to say you'll lose points or you'll fail the assignment, but to fail a class or to not graduate, those are much more serious consequences, and teachers may often back down from that. But we need to follow through on those things. So, and here, my final point on this slide is, you know, especially if you're working online, don't assume that you know what the students are doing online. Now, some students may copy paste translated work. And in that sense, you might be able to find it, because when it's online, there is a document, a history of the document, and you can see if there's been cutting and pasting going on. But often what students will do is they'll either have two windows open, or they'll have a separate device where they'll have DeepL open on one device, and they will look at that and type directly into Google Classroom or whatever program that they're using. So there is no evidence of cutting and pasting. And I have seen this all the time. When I go to Starbucks and I see university students there, that is exactly what they're doing. They've got DeepL open on one device and they're typing into another. And I've seen this in multiple locations around the city. So they know how to get away with using machine translation and not leaving a trace behind. Now, I've just talked about what educators can do, but I also talk to the students about what they should do, because they need to be able to protect themselves as well, especially if they've been falsely accused. And one thing I tell them is to keep a clear chain of progression. So save all the work, whether it's online or paper. And when they are saving online work, do not save over the original file. Always save as a different file name. Now that may be clear to us as educators and slightly older people, but it's not necessarily clear to the younger generation. And so I make them do this as part of their writing courses, so that if they are asked, how did you get to this point in your writing? They can say, look, here's my first draft, second, third, fourth, and they can show how they improved their writing over those drafts. But also you need to tell them, look, if I ask you how you wrote this, you need to be able to tell me how you did it. If I ask you why you chose this vocabulary word or this grammar structure that is way above you, you need to be able to explain where you found it or why you chose to use it. If they can't explain it, then they're out of luck, basically. I also like to tell students to, and to remind students, you know, they need to avoid the temptation of machine translation. And one of those things is not procrastinating. Don't leave assignments until the last minute. Have good time management skills. Also, don't be afraid to ask for help. Ask students, teachers, go to a language center, self-access center, get help. Also, if they're really stressed, you know, contact the teacher, see if you can get an extension on the deadline. And also telling students, you know, taking a break is okay. You know, sitting in front of your computer for 8 hours is not necessarily going to give you a clear head about what you should do. Go take a walk, go for a run, come back, and you may actually come up with a better plan than using machine translation. So working on these sorts of issues with your students is important. Now, for institutions, of course, I think it's important that institutions at the institutional level have clear guidelines for everyone, including staff, so that if there's an issue between a teacher and a student, that the staff also know what the guidelines are. And that when there are transgressions, that everyone follows through. It's not just the teacher, but the the institution supports the teacher and the consequences of whatever has happened. Because I think a lot of times as teachers feel unsupported by their institutions or that they may be reprimanded in some way. So having clear institutional support is important. And finally, I know a lot of places have self-access centers, but I would also argue that having a dedicated writing center or some other sort of academic help resources for students is important, so that if they want to do the right thing, they have a place to go and get additional help in order to do that. Now, to end, I'm just going to end with a question, which is, what's going to happen in a post-pandemic hybrid learning world? Because that's actually what we're facing in the future. Will things be the same again? Will we even need writing classes? At some point, maybe we can just allow machine translation. I don't know what that would mean for me as a teacher, but these are things we have to consider. I know some people have absolutely gone 100% in that direction. They love machine translation, and others are still fighting it tooth and nail. Now, it may depend on your institution and what type of teaching you're doing, but these are all things to consider. So I'm going to end here, and let's open it up for discussion or questions.
Yeah, so if you have a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it into chat, or you can use the icon to raise your hand and I will call you.
And if
no, oops, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if no one has any questions, I'd also be interested in knowing what is happening at other institutions, like if people have come up with alternative ideas for dealing with machine translation in the classroom.
Justin.
Hi, I'm a little bit curious about DeepL. I've just had a look on my computer here. I see it doesn't do Korean, so
right.
We don't have that yet, but I imagine it's something that's coming. So
right.
I'm wondering, why are they, in Japan, it seems so keen on DeepL over Google Translate?
Well, I think, so I don't know how Google Translate deals with Korean, but with Japanese, because Japanese doesn't really use pronouns, when it translates to English, Google Translate has to put a pronoun in there. So it will often put it. So then you'll get a sentence like, it interviewed the mother, when it would have been much easier for the student just to write, I interviewed my mother. But you'll get this it instead, because that's how Google Translate works. So in the past, for a lot of teachers, it was quite easy to find Google Translate because the pronoun usage, and there were other little tells like that. But DeepL doesn't do it. It looks at the whole context and it's able to understand appropriate pronouns and things like that. So our normal tells for finding translation programs didn't work. And especially in the first year of the pandemic, a lot of teachers were just tearing their hair out. Like, I know it's plagiarized. What is it? And I had that question too, until someone told me, go look at DeepL. That's what they're using. And I realized that is what they're using. So.
Thank you. Because I was concerned because here people tend to prefer a Korean product called Papago. I find that the level's pretty similar to Google Translator, and it just stands out. So it sounds concerning if it doesn't stand out anymore.
Well, back in 2020, I think DeepL only had 7 or 9 languages, and they keep adding more. So I imagine Korean is going to show up there sooner rather than later.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Michael.
Hi, Rachelle, thank you. I'm also based in Japan, and I also, like you, found out about DeepL last year, I believe. And I do a lot of corpus work with my university students. I teach PhDs.
Okay.
So I sometimes help them write their dissertations. And I didn't used to think like translation was an issue until just last year.
Right.
And I guess I would say to Justin and the Korean people who teach Korean, it must be coming, because I have a Mongolian student who gave me a machine translated thing. It must not have been DeepL, but you would think Mongolian is not ready yet, because these need a lot of data to get good progress. But I mean, I know
Yeah,
my
Mongolian
Mongolian
is not on
students,
the
like
list,
Rachelle
so,
said,
mm.
yeah, if they gave me such a good paper, I couldn't believe it.
So,
So,
Michael, I have a question for you. How do you
Hmm.
deal with machine translation with your PhD students?
I mean, thankfully, it's not really my job. I'm mostly a conversation. I'm mostly a spoken
Right.
teacher. So kind of it's their
Right.
it's their PI's job. I usually advise them, but I don't want to give advice on machine translated work. So it does kind of upset me in a sense.
Right.
And I realized I need new flags to detect them, just like you were saying. So I really resonated with what you were saying.
Well, one thing what I've told my Zemi students, so these are my 4th year seminar students, is every time they're using machine translation to color code it within their text. So if they're using DeepL, that gets color coded as green, or Grammarly is red, or whatever the case may be, so that they can actually see how much text they are relying on machine translation. And I actually get my high-level academic writing students to do this as well, to color code text so that they can see. And this is part of the process of them identifying how much they're actually using it or not.
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at things and helping them sort of understand what is acceptable and not. Now I saw someone, Sunny, you wrote in the chat, we have to start teaching how to use machine translation effectively. Yes, I agree. And I know here in Japan, there have been some workshops and seminars on teaching it to students. But the reality is teaching students to use machine translation properly, which means getting the students to translate themselves first, then comparing it against the machine translation, finding ways of fixing it, takes time. It can take, 1/3 to half of a semester to do it properly. So this may mean, like, in the future, we actually have a dedicated writing course, or like the first semester is dedicated to learning about how to do these things, because it takes time to do it. You can't just do it in one class. You need multiple classes to do it, and you probably need to do it every year to remind students what works and what doesn't. But again, like I'm teaching language learners, so this makes sense. But if you're teaching non-language learners who have to do English like once a week or something as a required course, how important is it? I don't know. And here I've just focused on writing, but this is going to be a problem in if students who write speeches and speaking, reading, just using, DeepL to translate the reading, so I don't have to bother, it's going to infiltrate all aspects of language learning.
Okay. On that note, I should probably end the presentation or end the Zoom classroom. So if anyone has any other questions, is there a way they can contact you?
Yes, actually, I'll just put I'll quickly put my email in the chat. All right, so it's r_meille@kufs.ac.jp. So you can always contact me that way.
Okay, everybody, if you could, a round of applause, or if you don't want to unmute yourself, you can also use the icon.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Thanks so much.
And there's about 1 minute before the next round of sessions usually start. So I'm going to close the Zoom meeting. Thank you for your presentation, and everybody, please enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.